So I guess when I was around 10 years old, I kind of figured out that I didn't want to hang out with my father anymore. And if I had to guess, he did this on purpose so that I wouldn't want to. So it was Saturday, and I was kind of bothering my mom, saying, I don't know what to do. My friends aren't home. I have nothing to do. And she goes, why don't you go ask your father to take you to a park? So I went upstairs, and my dad was always in his office working with paperwork. And I said, do you want to go to a park? And he said, okay. So then we went on about 5 or 10 errands. He had to go to Sears to return something that he bought there last weekend. Then he had to go to the post office and check his post office box and mail some stuff. Then he had to go to the Office Max, or the small office supply. The corner office supply place is what we had back in the mid-'80s. And he had to pick up paper clips or envelopes. Then he had to go pick up lawn fertilizer at the garden center. Then he had to go to an office complex. And he said, why don't you wait in the car while I go into this office complex? So after about 5 or 10 outings like this, I kind of realized that my father was making things very unpleasant if I wanted to hang out with him. Now that I'm a father and I have children, when I bring them out on the weekends, the first thing we do is we go and hit the park. The first thing we do is go to the lake. The first thing we do is go do an activity that they like to get some of that energy out of them and put them in a good mood. And then once we get done doing some activities that they like, then they have no problem going on a few dull errands with me, and they have a better attitude about it. So that's a piece of advice for any young parent. If you have some errands to do and you're bringing your kid with you, if possible, go bring them to the park first, or go do an activity with them, and that really puts them in a good mood. And then they have a better attitude, and they actually like going to a few stores with you to go on errands. But instead, my father wanted to make it clear that he really did not want to hang out with me. So he really went out of his way to set the precedent that if you go out with him, he was going to make a very boring, tedious Saturday afternoon with you. So the last time I hung out with him, the same thing happened. We had just got on 5 or 10 errands with him. Then we stopped by the park, played catch with a baseball. And then he wanted to stop off at the 5 and 10 store to pick up something for his office. And it was a hot day. It was a hot summer day. And I asked him, could I get something to drink? There are these little juices, and they were on sale for 25 cents in the cooler. And my dad says, no, that's not healthy. I got some juice in the car. So we got to the car. He said it's in the glove compartment. And he got out a tape, an audio tape that said Juice Newton. Now, Juice Newton is a country western singer. And he said, why, you don't like juice? And it's 90 degrees out, and I'm sweating, and I'm thirsty. And he couldn't get his son a little 25-cent juice at the 5 and 10 store. And he had a big grin on his face, and he was real happy with how witty he was getting out the juice tape. Now, I am telling you this, not because it was a traumatizing experience, but I'm telling you, these are the actions of somebody who does not want to hang out with kids. These are the actions of a man who does not like his son. He doesn't want to spend any time with his children. Part of an outing is you go out with your kids and then you stop on the way home and you buy them a frozen yogurt or a health shake or a cheap drink at the corner store. That's the sort of thing that kids remember. That's what makes the outing. But my father wanted to set the precedent that if you go out with him, he's going to make it a miserable time because he does not like kids. And I feel that my mother and him were something of a military arranged marriage. The military arranges these marriages to put their guys who look like this out of the Vietnam War into houses with loving young women, because the military understands that these are the guys that will never find loyalties for their family and will always side with the military. These are the guys that will choose the military even over their own family. So these guys are very important to the military. Whatever the military wants to do with these men's families is okay with these type of men. All right, so my parents got divorced in 1987 when I was around 12 years old. And it was just endless situations in where my dad acted antisocial, self-centered, and like he did not care about anybody else but himself. That was my mom's exact words. your father does not care about anybody else but himself. And she said that it's probably because he was an only child and his mother, Rowena, spoiled him too much. And that might be part of it. But his parents divorced when he was young, and he went on to live with Rowena, as he called her. And my mother said that one time Rowena said, if my son John came home and said, I just shot the next door neighbor, I would tell him, I bet you he deserved it, son. And she would never forget that Rowena told her that. So that was the sort of attitude that Rowena had with my father. And that was why my mother thought that he acted like a careless, self-centered, egotistical person who did not care about anybody else but himself. So they wound up getting a divorce around 1987, and I was around 12 years old. And my mother met somebody at church, and he was a little bit older than my mom. And they were talking at coffee hour after church. And my mother had an interest in antiques, and she had quite a few large books that she read on antiques. So this guy named Waldeck Thiel, or Wally Thiel, was impressed that she knew so much about antiques. And he was about to retire as an executive at a bank at Chase Manhattan. And he said that he was thinking about running a business where they would buy the best antiques and then sell them to people at a profit. He said that he thought it may be a good idea to open an antique shop. But for now, he knew some people who were new to the States. They were coming in from different countries, and they loved American antiques. So if he could get some advice on buying the best antiques, he could resell them to these people entering the States at a profit. I think that was how my mom explained it to me. But it was many years ago. But basically they started to talk a lot at church and kind of entertain the idea of possibly opening up an antique store or buying antiques to resell. So my father did not mind my mother talking to this guy. And I think he was about 20 years older than she was. So I guess in 1987, my mom was about 37 years old. And the guy that she was talking to was approaching his 60s. So my dad didn't let on like this bothered him at all. And the idea that my mom could earn money seemed to appeal to him. So my mother started to hang out with Wally Thiel more often. And they began to buy some antiques. And I think they stored them in a storage facility or at Wally's house. And so they would have to go around to different antique shops. And she would advise Wally what the best antiques were to buy. So they ended up spending a lot of time together. And eventually Wally asked her to leave my father and move with him to Connecticut, where he had a summer house. And to make a long story short, that is what she did. So I do not remember seeing my father upset about that ever. He did not let on like he was upset at all. He always acted the same. I never saw a look of hurt in his eyes. I never saw a look of anger in his eyes over the divorce. In fact, he acted very casual and unaffected by it. So I moved to Connecticut with my mom around 1988, and my father stayed in White Plains for a period of months to a year as they sold the old house. So I would go visit my dad on the weekends, and my father just stayed basically upstairs in his office. And when I would come visit him, I would love to go visit with the neighborhood kids, with my old friends. So I would go visit my father, and for the most part, he would get us pizza at night or prepare us dinner, like a frozen dinner. He wasn't much of a cook. But other than that, the weekends were spent outside with my friends. And as far as I could remember, my dad seemed very happy. He did not seem upset or angry at all. He never said, let's sit down and talk about the divorce. He always seemed preoccupied in his office, and he would always smile when he would come downstairs and say, what do you want on your pizza? And I was pretty happy just going out and hanging out on the block with my old buddies. So that is how I remember life after the divorce and the final days in White Plains, New York. So my father moved to Maryland after he sold the house in White Plains, and he got a job, and I forget what he did at his job, but I asked him how much he got paid, and he told me $80,000 a year, and that was in the late 80s. So that's a pretty good amount of money. So he had a condo in Maryland, and I went to go visit him one time. My brother and I flew out there. So my father had rented a condo, and it was a pretty nice condo, and it was right in Baltimore. And he brought us to a Y. It was like a athletic club or a YMCA, and it had a huge water slide in it. And I remember that was one of the best parts of the trip that we took to Maryland, was going to this Y or athletic club that had this huge water slide. It was like the same type of water slide that they would have in water parks. So I saw that my father was doing pretty good in Maryland, and I asked him how much was he making at his new job. And I remember specifically that he said $80,000 a year. And in the late 80s, that is a good amount of money. So he said that he was working at a business, at a corporation that was either owned or managed by two women. And I think he said they were good friends, and one had a great idea and the other one had connections or financing. And so the two went into business together. So two women owned this corporation, or they ran it. I'm pretty sure that they went into business together and they started this corporation because they were the big bosses. So my father thought it would be a good idea to date both of them. So we started going out with both of the women that ran that corporation, and that provoked jealousies between the two women. That provoked hostilities between those two women. So if you just got a divorce and were lucky enough to land a job for $80,000 a year back in 1987, and you started working at a company that the two head honchos were women, who in their right mind would attempt to date or fool around with both of those women to sabotage his employment and to ruin that company? So once again, this is a bizarre story concerning a man that seems to go out of his way to cause problems. So I have no idea what happened to that business, but I think that my dad said that it started not to do so well. And then they let him go. And I said, why would you do that at such a good job? I thought Maryland was great. I liked Baltimore. I liked the museums. I liked the athletic club. I liked your condo. Why would you sabotage that? And he said to me, I don't know. I thought about it, and I guess that I really did not like the job. And so I tried on purpose to be fired. So I guess he thought the best way to get fired was to begin to date the two women that owned or ran that corporation. So once again, I might guess, based on everything I know about my father, is that possibly that he had alternative motives for creating hostilities at that corporation. Maybe certain parties wanted to acquire that business. Maybe certain parties in the Baltimore area wanted to put that corporation out of business, and my father was just more than willing to help. And as everybody might know, the U.S. military moonlights. Their night job is taking over or handling America's corporations because they want a monopoly rule. They want a merger between the largest corporations and the military. And that will be your government. They want a communist government governed by a military-run government. That's the same thing that's happened in China. That's the same thing that's happened in Russia. That's the same thing that happened in Europe. So the last thing that I want to discuss in part one is that I guess around 1990, it was around Christmas time, my father drives back from Maryland, and he's lost his job in Maryland, and he wants to move to Connecticut, around where we live. So it's around Christmas time. I think it's a couple weeks after Christmas, and I remember that it is not too cold out, and my father has brought a few presents with him because he wasn't around on Christmas. So he picks me and my brother up at my mom's house, and he drives down to Federal Road in Brookfield, Connecticut. And there is a little motel that I believe is in Brookfield, but it might have been in New Milford. And it was right on Federal Road, and it was a little run down. It was just a little crappy motel that had a sidewalk in front and all the different motel doors that you could access from the street level. And so he rented that place. And so he brought us over there. And we went out and we got something to eat. I think we went to a nearby restaurant, or we brought takeout back to the motel room. And after we eat the takeout food, or after we have lunch, we open up the gifts that my father has gotten us for Christmas. And the main ones were walkie-talkies, were portable radios. And they look like something that the cops would use, or the military would use. They did not look like they would be a toy for kids. They looked like professional two-way radios, only they had long antennas that were about 1.5 feet long. So my dad says, I gotta go out now to meet a friend of mine about getting a house in Brookfield. But he goes, John, why don't you take one of the walkie-talkies and go to the far end of the motel and see what type of reception you could get with Chris, who will be stationed back in the motel room. So I gotta take off now, but have fun with your Christmas gift. So my dad leaves us with the walkie-talkies. He gets into his car and he takes off. So there my brother and I are at this rundown motel. The door's wide open to the room. My 9-year-old brother's in the room. I'm 13 or 14 and I'm down in the parking lot talking to my brother on the walkie-talkie. And my dad has taken off. So that is how my dad left things. So eventually, I did not hear my brother talking on the walkie-talkie. So I walked back to the room. The door was wide open and he's watching cartoons on TV. And I said, why weren't you answering me? And he said, I couldn't hear you. So once again, I guess it was a little bit of luck that my brother could not hear me so well on the walkie-talkie, because that got me to go back to the room and close the door, which is probably more safe than how my father had left it. So the only other thing I remember is that I was very sick. Whatever I had eaten had given me an upset stomach, a terrible headache, and a fever. I came down with all these symptoms, and I remember I was having a miserable time at that hotel. I had stomach problems. I felt like I was very hot, like with a fever, and I had a terrible splitting headache. And after 2 or 3 hours, my father returned. So once again, that is something that my dad would do. That is extremely dangerous. To go to a hotel and leave your kids to run around some rundown motel with walkie-talkies, leaving the door open. The whole thing just reeks of a setup. The whole thing just suggests the worst idea on how to parent kids.